Do you accept, Jonathan, that parliamentary constituencies should roughly be about the same size?
Yes, of course I do.
Well, isn't that what this is about?
Well, it's not really, because this is about reducing the number of MPs from 650 down to 600. There is a strong suspicion that 50 MPs was taken out because that will hit the Labour Party most. Once you go beyond 50, you tend to bite further into Conservative MPs. But the other issue is, which what you touched upon, is that there's 2 million people missing from this register.
But it's in the law.
That is not fair. Well,
it's a fairly powerful argument to say it's in the law. Parliament could change it.
Well, it's in the law because the Conservative government, or the Conservative coalition government at the time, had the votes in Parliament to pass that piece of legislation.
Right.
But we always said that to use the register based on a different way of getting on the register. You may remember the arguments we had over something called individual voter registration, where getting on the register became a little bit more burdensome. We always said, don't go for the register in November, December, wait a little bit longer, as indeed the Electoral Commission, and we all advised the government to look at the register this year, and they've ignored that.
Right. Putting that just to one side, do you accept that Labour at the moment, under the current drawing of the boundaries, has an unfair advantage?
No. No, they don't. This is a Tory argument about how the vote is distributed across the country. It's because in a lot of safe Conservative seats, a lot of Tory votes pile up, where the Labour vote tends to be more evenly distributed across the country.
Right, you're skewing this whole process. I mean, it's clear, isn't it, that actually the Labour Party will be the biggest loser.
No, it's not a skewed process at all. It has to happen. As we've just heard, the figures that are currently being used are 16 years out of date. An awful lot has changed across the country in terms of house building and people moving and everything else. And it's not a political process. It needs to be done. And I think it's absolutely right to reduce the number of members of Parliament as well.
Why?
We said, well, partly it's about saving money in terms of the cost of politics. We are the largest legislature in, I think, the Western world.
Why don't you do something about the House of Lords?
Well, that's also, I think, on the government's agenda as well. That's been spoken about, and we obviously have the ability for peers to resign. We've got 50 fewer peers than we had before. But look, two wrongs don't make a right.
It's stuffed to the gills, isn't it, the House of Lords? And actually, it's been stuffed even more by David Cameron in recent months. Surely the unelected House of Lords would be a better place to start.
I think you need to do both, actually, and I think that's what's going to happen. I do think it's right to have a fewer number of members of Parliament, and it must be right that MPs are representing roughly the same number of people. We get the same resources, we've got the same demands. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn seemed to be saying this morning that if you were in an urban area, you should somehow represent fewer number of people. That doesn't work or stack up at all. And the Labour Party has always complained about this. You know, the 1970 general election was fought on 1953 electoral data. The Labour Party's got history on this. It's time that the register was updated and the boundaries were updated.
Well, I wasn't born in 1970, so I don't know. I was born in 1978. But the issue is, there's 260 extra unelected peers in the House of Lords under this government, costing us something like 32 million a year. We're going to be losing our European members of Parliament. 73 MEPs are going to lose their jobs. So presumably, we as members of Parliament are going to have a greater legislative responsibility in the House of Commons. So why cut down to 600? Why not do it at 650 MPs, but equalise the constituencies on that basis?
Well, because something that Parliament have voted for, to cut the number of members of Parliament. We did it in the last Parliament. I think it's absolutely right. I say we are the largest legislature in, I think, the Western world. It doesn't make sense anymore. And I say, I think we should look at the number of peers as well. But look, peers have been created in the last few years from all parties. This is, and as I say, we now have the thing where actually peers are able to retire when they reach a certain age, and 50 have taken advantage of that.
Why is it fair that a Labour seat has around 5,000 fewer people or voters in it, and therefore you have an unfair advantage in terms of being elected than Conservative seats that have around 71,000 voters, so far higher than the average Labour seat?
Well, my Labour seat has over about 73,000 voters in it.
But I'm saying broadly, and you accept that, don't you, that there are Labour seats that are elected, people are elected on far fewer votes?
Well, that is why we've said that the principle of equalising the constituencies is the correct approach. But what we have at the moment is a very tight numerical number that the Boundary Commission have to work to with very limited flexibility. I mean, there used to be more flexibility in the process, so you could make more allowance for local factors, like, you know, I was hearing on the radio this morning there's seats which have got like a mountain range running through them, have been suggested on these proposals and things like that, which are just impractical. But
that's why you have the ability, when we're all now looking at the proposals, members of the public are, we've now got time to send in revisions, to point out practical things that don't work. There'll be public hearings. You know, we've got another, 2 years before this is actually finally voted on and accepted.
Indeed, but when push comes to shove, you've got to hit 75,000 with 5% either way. I mean, that's a much tighter range than what was a previous
But
approach.
if you've accepted the principle of equalisation, I mean, that's what it means, you know, having a number and then obviously a flexibility, a target.
You're keen to reduce the cost of politics, so why not reduce the number of ministers?
Well, that's something else that's going to be looked at. I mean, to be honest with you, I think...
Do you support that?
Well, I'm not sure, because, look, we're going to come on and talk about Brexit in a moment. I have to say, this is going to be a pretty busy government, doing more legislation, not leaving things to the EU. So, no, I don't think I would support that, having been a minister and seen how hard the ministers were.
No, I mean, but in a sense, although you've asked for the House of Lords to be looked at, it's not going to be looked at to all intents and purposes just at the moment, and there's no sign of the costs there being reduced. You don't want to reduce the number of ministers. You're really very keen on reducing the number of MPs. People may well conclude that it's because of party political reasons.
I think people will be wrong to conclude that. You know, everyone's always going to say, look, those who don't like the proposals will say it's party political. Those who do will say, actually, we're cutting across politics. It's got to be fairer to have equal-sized constituencies. The point is, this is overdue. It should have happened in the last Parliament, and it didn't. And therefore, we are now working on the basis of figures from 16 years ago. And I can see in my constituency, you know, there's been a massive amount of house building. There are people, it doesn't take account of people who have moved in. And it must be right to say we all get the same resources, members of Parliament. The amount of money we get to employ staff doesn't reflect the electorate that we have.
I think this part about ministers is actually very important, because the government are not saying they're going to reduce the size of the ministerial payroll.
People don't tend to when they're in power, though, do they?
No, indeed. So they're proportionately, they're going to be a bigger part of the chamber. So there's actually an issue about holding ministers to account. There'll be less backbenchers to hold the executive to account, and that cannot be fair.